Welcome to another episode of Saturday Cappuccino with the Saints, and this week we are going to discuss a very big saint. In fact, one of the biggest, beloved and revered both in the East and the West, and also one wrapped up in a thick layer of myth and legend, and one who has had an enormous, outsized impact on Christian art and culture for centuries, Saint George. But who is the real Saint George? Was he even a real person? Or is he only just a myth, a legend, a complete medieval fabrication, complete with fire-breathing dragons and beautiful princesses? Or is there a truth at the core of his legendary flavored tale? His story is fascinating, the real story. So get your armor on, grab your lance, and let's face down some dragons as we peel away some of those layers of myth to discover who the real St. George was. Across continents and centuries, one figure stands at the crossroads of history and myth. A Roman soldier, a Christian martyr, a dragon slayer, a symbol of courage so enduring that nations, armies, and entire cultures claim him as their own. This is St. George, the man behind the legend, and the legend that reshaped the world. Before the dragon, before the legend, there was a young man born in Cappadocia to a Christian mother and a military father. His name was George, a name meaning worker of the earth. St. George was born in late 3rd century, around 275 to 280 AD, in Cappadocia, an area roughly where modern-day Turkey is, a rugged region of Anatolia in the Roman Empire. This is one of the few details consistently preserved across ancient sources. His family background places him at the crossroads of cultures, Greek-speaking, Roman-governed, and deeply Christian. His father was a Christian Cappadocian, possibly named Gerontius, or there's different accounts of this, and often described as a military officer. His mother was a Christian woman from Palestine, traditionally from the region of Lydda, which is in the modern-day Israeli city of Lod, the city that later became the center of his cult and the site of his shrine. This mixed Cappadocian-Palestinian heritage explains why George's relics and veneration spread so widely across both the Greek East and the Semitic Christian world. Now, what do we know about his childhood and upbringing? The historical record is sparse, but what survives suggests that he was raised in a Christian household, unusual but not unheard of in the pre-persecution Roman Empire. His father died when George was young, and he and his mother relocated to Palestine, likely to Lydda, his mother's hometown. Growing up in a military family in the frontier region of the empire made a military career for George almost inevitable. While we lack detailed anecdotes, the combination of Christian piety and Roman discipline shaped the man he became, loyal, principled, and unafraid of imperial authority. Like many sons of Roman officers, George likely entered military service as a teenager. By his early 20s, he had already risen to the rank of tribune, a significant command position, evidence both of his competence and his military family background. He was eventually stationed in Nicomedia, the imperial capital under the Emperor Diocletian, placing him at the center of political and religious tensions that would define his fate. This is the historical George, before dragons, before legend, before the iconography, a young officer shaped by faith, family, and frontier life. Raised in the faith, trained in the discipline of Rome, George entered adulthood at a moment when the empire was tightening its grip on Christians. And as I mentioned, the emperor at the time was Diocletian. Now, we have discussed Diocletian a few times on this podcast, as it was during his great persecution of Christianity that so many were martyred for the faith. But, since not everyone watching today may have watched those prior episodes, it is probably a good idea to give a brief background on who Diocletian was and what led to this wave of terror, the greatest in Christian history, against the early church. Because in order to understand the story of St. George, you really have to understand the context of what was happening in the Roman Empire at the time when he lived. Diocletian was born in Dalmatia, which is roughly equivalent to modern-day Croatia, and was of humble background. He rose through the Roman military, serving under the emperors Aurelian, Probus, and Carus. He was proclaimed emperor by the army in 284 AD after the mysterious death of Emperor Numerian. Now, some say he had a hand in it, but it was never asserted or proven during his lifetime. Certainly it would not be shocking if he did. Emperors often came to power as a result of palace intrigue and murder. The history books are bulging with such stories. But either way, after the death of Numerian, a very brief civil war erupted, and Diocletian defeated rival Quirinius to secure sole rule of the empire. So what did Diocletian do as emperor? Well, he stabilized the empire after decades of chaos. The Roman Empire had endured 50 years of civil wars, invasions, and economic collapse. Diocletian restored order through stronger borders, crushing rebellions, and reorganizing the military and the bureaucracy. He created the tetrarchy, the rule of four. To solve the perpetual problem of ruling a massive empire, he split the empire into East and West. He appointed Maximian as co-Augustus to act as the co-senior emperor in the West. He added two junior emperors called Caesars, Galerius and Constantius. Now, here's a note. Constantius was Constantine the Great's father, by the way, and this will have a huge impact, not only on Christian history, but world history. It really is ironic to contemplate how the greatest persecutor of Christians in Roman history inadvertently paved the way for the emperor who legalized Christianity. It really does show God really does have a sense of humor. On your screen is a picture of the world-famous statue of the four tetrarchs that is now located in Venice, Italy, after having been looted from Constantinople during the shameful Fourth Crusade in 1204. This tetrarchy system was actually a good idea. It improved defense, it clarified succession, and reduced civil wars, which were a constant issue during the Roman Empire. It was one of the most influential political reforms in Roman history. Diocletian also reformed the economy and the government. He reorganized provinces into larger dioceses. We get our church term diocese from Diocletian. Again, quite ironic, right? Especially given what comes next. He expanded the imperial bureaucracy, he reformed taxation, and he issued the Edict on Maximum Prices to curb inflation, though it largely failed. I just have to add an editorial note. As such schemes continue to fail now, we really don't learn much from history, it appears, and we tend to do the same stupid thing over and over again, such as making edicts on maximum prices. Rinse and repeat. But I digress. And he was the only Roman emperor to voluntarily retire. In 305, Diocletian abdicated, something no other Roman emperor had ever done. He retired to his palace at Split, which is now in the modern nation of Croatia, tending his gardens until his death. These reforms laid the groundwork for the later Byzantine Empire, and his assurance of a peaceful transfer of power by his abdication assured that he was a very effective and competent emperor. So, if he had just stopped here, he would be remembered today as one of Rome's truly great emperors. But he did not stop there, and his reputation is rightfully blackened because of what else he did as emperor. In 303 AD, Diocletian suddenly issued edicts ordering the destruction of Christian churches, the burning of scriptures, the arrest of clergy, and he forced all citizens, pagans and Christians alike, empire-wide, to sacrifice to the Roman gods. This is the policy that brought Christianity into direct conflict with Rome, and the enforcement of it became the largest and most systematic persecution of Christians in Roman history. Many of the martyrs we have discussed on this podcast over the last few months were killed by the Roman Empire under Diocletian. It was, without a doubt, the worst and most terrible time endured by the early church. But an interesting question to ponder is this: why? Why did he do it? Diocletian, from his early life, did not particularly have an interest in Christianity one way or the other. Before the rise of Diocletian, Rome was bleeding. 50 years of chaos had shattered the empire, and this weighed on what happened next. Emperors were murdered, borders collapsing, armies turning against their own. The world's greatest power stood on the edge of ruin. And Diocletian, as I said, did not begin his reign intending to persecute Christians. The Great Persecution of 303 AD emerged from a convergence of political, religious, and ideological pressures, especially the influence of his junior emperor, Caesar, Galerius, fears about imperial unity, and a belief that Christianity was undermining Rome's relationship with the gods. Contemporary sources, especially Lactantius, say Galerius, a fanatically traditional pagan, relentlessly pressured Diocletian to act. In late 302, Galerius demanded a full empire-wide purge, but Diocletian hesitated. This moment is often seen as the tipping point. Christianity was seen as a threat to Roman unity, Galerius said. By 300 AD, Christians were fairly numerous. They were possibly a little over 10% of the empire. They were increasingly influential in cities, especially, and even in the imperial bureaucracy. And refusing to participate in the imperial cult, public sacrifices, and civic festivals, to Diocletian, who saw himself as a restorer of Roman tradition, looked like a crack in the ideological foundation of his empire. But the army was the flashpoint. Diocletian had already purged Christians from the army earlier in his reign. But several incidences occurred. Christians refusing to participate in divination rituals, for example, were interpreted as sabotaging Rome's sacred military rites. And no doubt, this is where St. George enters the story. Eusebius even claims that the persecution began in the army before spreading outward. Diocletian's entire political program, his reforms, the tetrarchy, the imperial ceremony built up around his emperorship, was built on traditional Roman religion, divine legitimacy that comes straight from the Roman gods, and state control. Christian refusal to sacrifice was interpreted not as a private belief, which, to be quite honest, they didn't care what you believed privately, but as a political rebellion and a threat to the Pax Deorum, or otherwise known as the peace with the gods, which the Romans took very seriously. Several incidents pushed Diocletian from suspicion to action. One, there was a failed divination ritual in Antioch, which was blamed on Christians making the sign of the cross. During the rite, there was a Christian deacon named Romanus who publicly denounced pagan sacrifice. Diocletian then ordered all soldiers to sacrifice or to be discharged. These were interpreted as open defiance of his imperial authority. And Diocletian's first edict on February 23, 303, was harsh, but not initially bloody. Churches were destroyed, scriptures burned, Christians were barred from legal rights and stripped of rank, but it wasn't widespread murder. Galerius, however, pushed for executions. Diocletian again resisted at first, but subsequent edicts escalated to the arrest of the clergy, forced universal sacrifice, and the death for a refusal. This is why the persecution was most severe in the Eastern Empire, where Galerius held sway, and also where St. George was serving. Well, one thing that is often overlooked by modern secular historians is the importance of what happened at the Oracle of Apollo. Diocletian was told by an Apollo oracle that Christians were preventing the god from speaking. This was a terrible omen, and someone like Diocletian took this with deadly seriousness. This was interpreted as proof that Christians were angering the gods and endangering the safety of the entire empire. And that oracle, combined with Galerius's pressure, pushed Diocletian into launching the Great Persecution. And this policy of persecution of Christians brought St. George, a tribune, and now a member of the Praetorian Guard, I mean, that's the personal bodyguard of the emperor himself, right into the very eye of the storm. And in the winter of 302, right before the general edict against all Christians throughout the empire, the Roman Empire stood on the edge of that storm. Divination rituals had failed. The gods had fallen silent. And in the palace of Nicomedia, the emperor Diocletian prepared a decree that would reshape history. The emperor's advisors demanded action. They blamed the Christians for the silence of Apollo, for the anger of the gods, and for the instability of the empire itself. And then a single soldier stepped forward into the imperial court, a man Diocletian knew, a man the army respected, a man named George. George says, "Sire, I can no longer serve under this command." The emperor says, "You resign now, when the empire needs unity?" George says, "I serve a higher king, and I cannot stand silent while you condemn the innocent." The co-emperor Galerius says, "You dare speak against the emperor's sacred duty, against the gods who guard Rome?" George then says, "I dare speak the truth. Your gods are not gods, and no decree can silence the followers of Christ." In that moment, the court froze. A Roman officer had accused the empire itself of falsehood. It was more than defiance. It was treason. And then Diocletian spoke. "George, you are young, gifted. I have watched your rise. Do not throw away your life. Offer sacrifice, honor the gods, and I will raise you higher still." George kneels, not in submission, but in resolve, and lays down his sword, and says, "I will not sacrifice to stone and smoke. I will not betray the one who gave his life for mine." To Diocletian, this was madness. To George, it was freedom. Diocletian then says, "You leave me no choice. Your stubbornness destroys you." George says, "My death is not defeat. It is witness." And with those words, the tribune was taken away, not as a criminal, but as a martyr in the making. The confrontation between George and Diocletian was more than a clash of wills. It was a collision of two worlds, the old empire of fear and sacrifice, and a new kingdom built on faith and courage. Within days, Diocletian's edict would ignite the great persecution, but the defiance of one soldier would echo far beyond the emperor's reach. What followed became the foundation of his sainthood. George endured torture meant to break the strongest of men, but the accounts, ancient, poetic, and reverent, describe a man who would not yield. George was stretched on a rack, his limbs pulled apart, while executioners tore at his flesh with iron hooks. This is one of the earliest and most consistently attested torments. He was repeatedly beaten with rods and scourged until his body was torn and bleeding. This appears in every early passion narrative of St. George's torments. Some accounts describe him being burned with torches or placed near flames to force his recantation. Later, medieval traditions describe George being bound to a spiked wheel that tore his body, similar to the torture of St. Catherine. This version appears in later biographies of St. George, as well as many artistic depictions in the Middle Ages. A dramatic and possibly legendary episode claims that he was plunged into boiling water continuously, but miraculously survived the ordeal. This belongs to the more elaborate medieval cycles of George's tale. Some traditions say he was suspended over flames for long periods of time, as another attempt to break his resolve and will. He was reportedly forced to wear red-hot iron shoes with nails pointing inward while being made to run long distances. A few late accounts describe him as being beaten with a massive hammer, again, part of the more fantastical medieval elaborations of his tortures. In some accounts, he was thrown alive into a boiling lime pit and somehow miraculously survived this event. Other accounts record that he was chained in a dark cell, starved, and left to die slowly, an element consistent with early Christian martyr narratives. And after all these torments, both the historical and legendary ones, George was ultimately beheaded, the standard Roman method for executing soldiers and citizens alike. This is the one universally attested historical detail about St. George. In the legendary tradition, George's endurance and serenity under torture caused guards to convert, onlookers to proclaim Christ, and members of the imperial court to question the emperor's cruelty in this manner. These elements reflect the classic pattern of early Christian martyr acts, where the martyr's courage becomes a catalyst for faith. Now, I understand it can all be a bit much here. Just the sheer number of grotesque and over-the-top tortures attributed to St. George is astonishing and, to be honest, stretches credulity to the limit. In fact, a bit beyond the limit. No one would survive all these tortures. But I think what is being recorded here, with all the legendary barnacles that have attached to this story, is making a deeper point, and that is why they are portrayed as extreme as they are. The sheer number of tortures recorded for St. George, especially in medieval biographies, reflects a blend of historical martyrdom tradition, symbolic storytelling, and legendary embellishment. And here's why his passion narrative became so elaborate. St. George was a real person and a real Roman soldier who defied Emperor Diocletian's edict against Christians. His arrest, torture, and execution were real events within the Diocletian persecution. Early Christian texts often emphasized the physical suffering of the martyr as proof of spiritual triumph. So even the earliest accounts included brutal torments like scourging, the rack, and imprisonment. By the 5th and 6th centuries, George's cult had spread widely, especially in the East. Later texts, like the Passio Georgi, Passion of St. George, added miraculous survivals in boiling water, spiked wheels, fire, and the hammer blows. These tortures weren't just sadistic, they were symbolic trials, each one testing a different virtue: endurance, purity, faith, and courage. Artists and storytellers then, as now, needed visual drama to inspire awe and devotion. Each torture became a scene, a tableau for frescoes, icons, and sermons. The more George suffered, the more miraculous his survival seemed, reinforcing his role as a heavenly warrior. In the East, especially in Cappadocia and Palestine, George was revered as a miracle worker. In the West, especially during the Crusades, his legend fused with chivalry ideals. Torture scenes multiplied as his cult adapted to different cultures, each adding their own motifs of suffering and triumph. And his tortures also mirror Christ's passion, the scourging, mocking, imprisonment, and then the final execution. George became a Christ-like figure, embodying the ideal of redemptive suffering. His endurance was said to convert guards and onlookers, making his pain and torment a tool of evangelization. And finally, there is this fact. St. George's suffering, especially in its legendary elaboration, functions as a symbolic stand-in for the countless unnamed martyrs of the Diocletian persecution. No doubt many of them suffered all of the tortures that were recounted to George. Diocletian's persecution was vast, systematic, and brutal, targeting clergy, scriptures, and lay believers across the empire. While some martyrs were recorded, like St. Agnes, Sebastian, St. Lucy, all friends of the show, by the way, and many we have covered, Most victims remain anonymous. Their story is lost to time. George's detailed passion narrative becomes a proxy, giving voice and imagery to the suffering of those whose names were never written down. His story includes every major torture motif: scourging, rack, fire, imprisonment, psychological torment, and then final execution. These weren't just personal trials, they were representative trials, dramatizing what many Christians likely endured. By enduring all, George becomes the archetypical martyr, absorbing the pain of the multitude into one heroic figure. In Christian theology, suffering is redemptive when united with Christ's passion. George's exaggerated torments mirror Christ's own in a way, making him a Christ-like figure whose pain transcends biography. His endurance becomes a liturgical icon, a way to meditate on the mystery of suffering and divine justice. This is why the depictions of the tortures of St. George are so extreme. I mean, sometimes reading accounts of the torments and tortures of St. George make it seem like they were written by Quentin Tarantino. They are meant to represent the thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of martyrs who are known only to God. And I can't help but think that St. George would definitely approve taking on his role of representing the nameless, faceless, other heroes of our faith. St. George's endurance inspired conversions. His courage shook the empire. And finally, on April 23rd, George was executed by beheading, a martyr whose blood became the seed of a legend. His body was taken to Lydda, his mother's hometown, where believers built a shrine over his tomb. A church stands there still today, and a picture of it is on your screen. And from that place, his story spread across the empire, from soldier to martyr, from martyr to legend, from legend to symbol of courage for nations and centuries to come. George's death resonated across cultures because it embodied courage against tyranny, loyalty to conscience over empire, and the ideal Christian soldier, the triumph of faith over fear. By the 4th century, he was already revered across the Mediterranean. By the 5th century, his cult had reached the Western Empire. His martyrdom became the foundation for everything that followed: the dragon legend, the crusader visions, the national patronages, and his global legacy. Rome tried to silence him. Instead, his story grew wings. And soon, a new legend would rise, one that would transform a martyr into something even more elaborate. Centuries after George's martyrdom, a new story started to take shape, not in the courts of emperors, but in the imaginations of monks, storytellers, and pilgrims. A story of terror, a story of courage, and a story of a dragon. For the first 3 centuries after his death, St. George was remembered not as a dragon slayer, but as a soldier martyr, a man who defied an emperor and paid for it with his life. His earliest devotees spoke of courage, endurance, and miraculous healings at his tomb. But there were no princesses, no lakes, and no dragons. So, how did a Roman officer from Cappadocia, who was a martyr, become the hero of one of the most enduring monster-slaying legends in the world? It is a very interesting story. And it starts in the Middle Ages, when Christian storytellers, artists, and preachers sought symbols powerful enough to communicate spiritual truths to a largely illiterate world. The dragon was already a universal image, an ancient shorthand for chaos, evil, and the forces that devour the innocent. From Mesopotamia to Greece, from the Hebrew Scriptures to the book of Revelation, the dragon represented the enemy of God and humanity, Satan. By the 10th century, as George's cult spread across the Mediterranean, his story began to absorb this older mythic language. In regions threatened by war, plague, or political collapse, the dragon became a metaphor for whatever terrorized the community. and George, already venerated as a protector, naturally stepped into the role of the one who confronts it. For medieval Christians, the tale of George and the Dragon wasn't fantasy. It was moral instruction. The princess symbolized the vulnerable soul. The dragon symbolized sin, tyranny, or the devil himself. And George, mounted on a white horse, became the model of Christian courage, charging into danger, not for glory, but to save others. As the story traveled, it evolved. In the East, George is calm and composed, such as you see on the left, spearing the dragon with almost serene precision. In the West, such as you see on the right, he becomes a chivalric knight, armored and dynamic, embodying the ideals of medieval knighthood. Each culture reshaped the legend to reflect its own fears, hopes, and ideals. But beneath every variation lies the same core truth. The dragon is not a historical creature. It is a symbolic one, and George's victory over it is a spiritual drama, not a zoological one. In the end, St. George became associated with the dragon because the world needed a story about courage in the face of overwhelming darkness, and the triumph of good over evil, and about the possibility that one's bravery can save an entire community. The dragons may change from age to age, but the need for a dragon slayer endures. And no doubt, few individuals, in fact, I would wager no individual in history, has created a deeper and more elaborate legendary and mythological veneer around them than St. George has. I mean, it's almost as if we're talking about two St. Georges. One is a real man, a Roman soldier who died for the Christian faith. The other is a mythic hero, a dragon slayer whose legend swept across the continents. And to understand St. George and his importance, we must hold both of these truths together. But there is also no doubt that it is the legendary George, the dragon slayer George, that has captured the imagination of not just the medieval Christian world, but of the Muslim world, and, to a large extent, the modern world. Our idea of what a hero, quote-unquote, should be like has been greatly shaped by the traditions surrounding St. George. And there are numerous stories about this George that have dug their roots deep into our culture. And the most famous of these is probably the legend of St. George, the Princess, and the City. On your screen is a wonderful painting of this legend titled St. George and the Dragon, created by the Italian Renaissance artist Paolo Uccello around 1470. I mean, it is just one of countless examples of St. George that show up in art, but it illustrates this core story. And at its core, this story tells of a city terrorized by a dragon, a princess chosen as a sacrifice, and a stranger knight, St. George, who intervenes, defeats the monster, and leads the city to conversion. But this core story is actually a constellation of narrative variants. The city is usually Cyrene, which is in Libya, although sometimes it's unnamed, and it suffers under a dragon that lives in a nearby lake or marsh. At first, the people appease the dragon with sheep. When the sheep run out, they offer children, chosen by lottery. The lottery symbolizes a society collapsing into fear, randomness, and moral paralysis. Eventually, the lot falls on the king's daughter. The king begs for her life, but the people insist. The law applies to all, including the princess. She is sent out dressed as a bride, symbolizing innocence, sacrifice, and the city's last hope. George, a foreign soldier knight, rides by and sees the princess weeping. She warns him to flee. He refuses, invoking Christ as the source of courage. George confronts the dragon. He wounds it with his lance, the famous Ascalon in later versions. A side note, sometimes Ascalon is depicted as a sword. And as an additional side note, Winston Churchill's plane was codenamed Ascalon in World War II, based on the legend of St. George. Very appropriate, I think, for the Prime Minister of Great Britain, since St. George is England's patron saint. But I digress, and back to the story. The princess then leads the subdued dragon, after he kind of falls to St. George's Ascalon, into the city with her girdle, a symbol of purity overcoming chaos and Satan. George offers to kill the dragon if the people accept Christianity. They agree. George then slays the dragon. The king builds a church on the spot, and a spring of healing water appears. This is the quote-unquote standard medieval form of this story, but there are many, many variants. There is even a version of this story that appear in Islamic and Middle Eastern adaptations. In these traditions, George is known as Al-Qadir, and he appears as a righteous servant of God. The dragon becomes a jinn, a serpent, or some other tyrannical creature. The princess may be absent. Instead, George rescues the community. The story emphasizes God's power and George's piety, not conversion. In Middle Eastern Muslim folklore, St. George is often identified as a mysterious immortal guide. Stories describe him appearing to travelers, healing the sick and protecting the oppressed. Now here's why this matters. It shows that St. George, uniquely among Christian saints, is a cross-religious figure. I know the Virgin Mary is revered by Muslims, but off the top of my head, I can't think of any other saints that have this cross-cultural pollination like this. His shrines in Palestine and Lebanon are visited by Christians and Muslims alike. And the legend's adaptability comes from its basic archetype structure. The dragon represents chaos, tyranny, paganism, fear, and the old world. The princess represents innocence, the endangered community, or the soul. The city represents civilization on the brink of collapse. And St. George represents the righteous outsider, divine intervention, and moral courage. The battle is the triumph of good over evil and spiritual warfare. The conversion of the city is renewal, rebirth, and the new world order. And because these symbols are universal, the story easily migrated across cultures, religions, and artistic traditions. Now, if you are a big Greek mythology fan like me, I'm sure you recognize a very strong similarity of this tale to the tale of Perseus rescuing Andromeda from the Kraken. They aren't the same story, of course, but they sort of rhyme. But this archetypical hero story that has existed since the dawn of time. Anybody who ever read or watched the PBS series Hero of a Thousand Faces with Joseph Campbell knows what I'm talking about. It is the story of the hero. It has been around forever, and it latched on quite easily to this story of St. George. And of course, a big saint like St. George has had a huge impact on the world of art. Across centuries and continents, St. George has been more than a saint. He is a mirror for human aspiration, courage, sacrifice, and the hope that good can triumph over evil. And through brushstrokes, mosaics, sculptures, and stories, he has shaped the world of art and the world of imagination. On your screen is the painting St. George and the Dragon, painted by the Italian High Renaissance artist Raphael around 1505 to 1506. And it was in the Renaissance when George truly became transformed into the image we have of him now in our collective imagination. That period transformed George into a showcase where artists could really display the mastery of their craft. Anatomy, perspective, motion, every technical breakthrough found expression in the clash between George and his horse and the dragon. Raphael painted him as the ideal Christian knight. Donatello sculpted him as a young soldier, stepping out of the Middle Ages and into modernity. Through George, artists explored what it meant to be heroic. In the East, St. George became one of the most frequently depicted warrior saints. Russian and Byzantine icons show him as a calm, spiritualized warrior, emphasizing divine protection rather than physical struggle. These icons shaped Orthodox visual language for centuries, influencing color palettes, composition, and the theology of sacred image. His image helped define the entire genre of military saints, often paired with St. Demetrius. In many of these icons, George's spear is crowned with a cross. The message is unmistakable. It is not the soldier who triumphs, but the faith he carries. The spear is the cross, and the victory is Christ's. During the High Middle Ages, St. George's popularity exploded across Europe. He appeared in Gothic stained glass, such as Notre Dame, Chartres, and countless other cathedrals, illuminated manuscripts, church fresco cycles, and heraldic art. The red cross on white, that's St. George's cross. Stained glass especially used his story to teach moral lessons to illiterate congregations. And his image became a visual sermon: bravery, faith, and divine aid. The story of St. George and the Princess remained popular well into the 19th century with artists, especially pre-Raphaelite artists such as Rossetti. On your screen is one of his most famous works, The Wedding of St. George and Princess Sabra, that he painted in 1857. In this version, Rossetti did not paint St. George as the dragon-slaying knight in action. Instead, he painted the aftermath, the wedding, the embrace, the intimate human moment after the monster is dead. This is crucial. Rossetti transformed St. George from a heroic warrior into a romantic, introspective, almost mystical lover. St. George sits in golden armor, not triumphant, but contemplative. Princess Sabra leans close, their bodies intertwined in a tender, almost private moment. George threads a lock of Sabra's hair through his helmet, a symbolic binding of their lives. The slain dragon lies in the background, almost incidental to the story. The dragon is minimized. The emotional union is the true subject. The painting is saturated with pre-Raphaelite color, deep reds, golds, and greens. The figures are compressed into a tight, intimate space, heightening psychological intensity. Rossetti painted himself as St. George and Elizabeth Siddell as Princess Sabra. This was shortly before Siddell's death, and the painting is often read as a bittersweet memorial to her. Rossetti's St. George is a perfect example of Victorian-era myth-making on canvas. The medieval legend becomes a psychological drama. The dragon becomes a symbol, not a creature. The saint becomes a lover, not a martyr. And the princess becomes a pre-Raphaelite icon, not a victim. This is the moment when St. George stops being a universal hero and becomes a deeply personal figure in the hands of a Victorian artist. Now, to editorialize for a moment, and I do really admire this painting, so take this as the spirit it's meant. But we have veered very far from the real St. George here, I think. I mean, there is almost none of the 4th century Christian martyr hero left here. He has been reduced to almost a cartoonish Harlequin romance novel cover, which I'm sure this painting has inspired more than a few of them. Still, I do like the painting, so don't put angry comments on this channel, but it really isn't about the real St. George anymore. And veering even further away from the real St. George, but still no doubt overwhelmingly influenced by centuries of his imagery, is the knight versus dragon trope in our modern entertainment and video games. I mean, you see it everywhere. In fantasy novels, video games, films, comic books, tabletop real player games like Dungeons and Dragons, and all trace back to their origins in the St. George legend. He is arguably the single most influential source for the modern fantasy hero. The knight and the dragon today is a universal symbol, and it all began with St. George. From Tolkien's Middle-earth to video games and graphic novels, the template remains the same: a lone hero, a monstrous adversary, and the eternal struggle between order and chaos. St. George is the ancestor of every fantasy epic you've ever seen or read. And few saints have crossed as many borders as George. He is the patron saint of England, Georgia, Ethiopia, Catalonia, and dozens more. Muslims revere him as Al-Qadir. Crusaders marched under his banner. Artists painted him in every style: Byzantine, Gothic, Renaissance, Baroque. His image became a universal language: courage in the face of evil, faith in the face of power, hope in the face of fear. England celebrates St. George's Day with a mix of patriotic pageantry, medieval nostalgia, and community festivals, ranging from parades and Morris dancing to dragon-themed reenactments and large public gatherings. Many towns host processions featuring St. George and the Dragon, often accompanied by local groups, marching bands, and medieval reenactors. Traditional English folk dancing is a staple of St. George's Day celebrations, especially in historic market towns. Punch and Judy shows are popular at this classic sea-style puppet show, and they appear at many festivals, especially in places like Salisbury. A long-standing custom on St. George's Day is to wear a red rose, England's national flower, and you wear it on your lapel on St. George's Day. Flying the St. George's Cross, which you see on your screen, is popular in homes, pubs, and civic buildings, and they often also will display the red and white flag on this day. And cathedrals and parish churches hold special liturgies, often including the hymn Jerusalem. They do it up big in London on the Feast of St. George in Trafalgar Square. They have food stalls, live music, family activities, and an appearance by St. George and the Dragon. St. George became England's national patron saint during the Tudor period, though his popularity surged earlier during the Crusades and the 100 Years' War. Efforts to revive St. George's Day as a major national celebration have grown since the 2010s, leading to more festivals and public events. England celebrates St. George's Day with a blend of patriotism, medieval revivalism, and community festivity, from Trafalgar Square's major gatherings to small-town parades with dragons. The day continues to grow in popularity as a marker of English identity. Spain celebrates St. George's Day, otherwise known as Dia de San Jorge, with deeply regional traditions, most famously Catalonia's Day of the Book and the Rose, where people exchange roses and books, turning cities like Barcelona into open-air literary festivals. Historically, men gave roses on St. George's Day and women gave books. Today, everybody exchanges both. The Catalan tradition of exchanging roses and books has medieval roots, the roses, and modern literary roots, the books, promoted in 1923 to honor Cervantes and Shakespeare. This fusion of love and literature gives the day its uniquely warm, romantic atmosphere, so much so that many visitors mistake it for a second Valentine's Day. The country of Georgia honors St. George more deeply and more widely than almost any nation on earth. The country celebrates him twice a year, on May 6th and November 23rd, with the latter being an official public holiday. The day blends ancient Christian devotion, medieval national identity, and pre-Christian folk customs, making it one of Georgia's most culturally changed celebrations. Now, why does St. George matter so much to Georgia? He is the patron saint of the entire nation, and the St. George Cross is on the national flag, as you can see by the picture on your screen. Georgia has at least 365 churches dedicated to him, one for every day of the year. His image appears on medieval royal seals and the modern national emblem. The cult of St. George in Georgia dates back to the 4th century, possibly introduced by St. Nino, the evangelizer of Georgia. Folk tradition even claims that St. George's body was mystically distributed across Georgia, with shrines marking each place. Bells ring in every church across the country on St. George's Day. Priests conduct special services asking for the saint's protection, and major cathedrals hold large, solemn liturgies. Despite commemorating his martyrdom, the day is joyful, Families gather for large feasts. Traditional dancing and singing fill homes and village squares, and markets and streets fill with the aromas of Georgian cuisine. People visit ancient monasteries, mountain chapels, and remote cliffside churches. Many of these are dedicated to St. George and decorated with frescoes of his miracles. Some regions preserve older syncretic customs that go back before Christianity. In some places, locals still sacrifice sheep or roosters, despite clergy discouragement. I mean, I don't know what that's all about. It sounds a little creepy. This practice is pagan in origin, not Christian. People will circle the church 3 or 7 times as the choir sings praises. Icon slaves that wear white robes, carry chains, crawl on their knees, or lie at the threshold for worshippers to step over them, an act of humility and devotion. These rituals reveal how deeply embedded St. George is in Georgian folk spirituality. I mean, few countries remember St. George with such intensity, continuity, and cultural depth. I mean, it is the name of the country, so they really like St. George in Georgia. St. George's Day in Ethiopia, known locally as Jena Georgis, is one of the country's most vibrant Orthodox celebrations, centered on massive pilgrimages, all-night liturgies, and especially the spectacular festivities at Lalabella's rock-hewn church of Bet Georgis, or St. George. Some communities also celebrate a January 26th feast associated with the scattering of his bone, especially around Lalabella that you see pictured on your screen. Churches across Ethiopia hold night-long prayers, chanting, and processions. Priests and deacons perform liturgical dances with drums. Faithful wear white shama garments and bring offerings of candles and incense. And Lalabella's monolithic Church of St. George, often called the eighth wonder of the world, is a spectacular epicenter of this celebration. Again, a picture of it is on your screen. Thousands gather around the sunken cruciform church for processions with icons of St. George, blessings from clergy, communal chanting and dancing. The January 26th celebration here is described as impressive and colorful, drawing pilgrims from across the country. St. George is considered a protector of the nation, especially in times of war. His icon was famously carried into the Battle of Adwa in 1896, where Ethiopia defeated Italian forces, an event still tied to his intercession. He is the patron of soldiers, horsemen, farmers, craftsmen, and in modern times, scouts. Many communities parade paintings of St. George slaying the dragon, a symbol of good triumphing over evil. These icons are believed to bring protection and blessing to the region. After liturgy, families gather for festive meals that may include Dora Wat, which is a spicy chicken stew, Tella, which is traditional beer, and have coffee ceremonies honoring hospitality and community. St. George is not just a saint. He is a national symbol, a military protector, and a spiritual guardian. His feast day blends deep Orthodox devotion, national pride, ancient ritual, and local color and communal joy. St. George's Day in Palestine, celebrated on May 5th and 6th in the town of Al-Qadir near Bethlehem, is one of the most remarkable cross-faith celebrations in the Middle East, uniting Palestinian Christians and Muslims in a shared devotion to the saint that they call Martyrs by the Palestinian Christians or Al-Qadir by the Muslims. The heart of the celebration is the monastery of St. George in Al-Qadir, shown here on your screen. Pilgrims come from across the West Bank. Families gather under the olive trees surrounding the monastery for picnics and fellowship. Visitors trade loaves of bread as a sign of blessing and community. One of the most distinctive features is the offering of animals, usually sheep, goats, or cows, in fulfillment of vows. The meat is shared with the poor or distributed among families. This practice is rooted in a Byzantine-era folk tale about a young man who sacrificed his family's only cow in honor of St. George and was rewarded with a miraculous vision. For Palestinian Christians, the feast day is a major day for baptizing infants, bringing children to receive special blessings. asking St. George for protection and health. Muslims revere St. George as Al-Qadir, a mysterious righteous figure associated with protection, healing, and guidance. Muslim families visit the monastery, offer vows, and participate in the communal rituals. Local tradition holds that St. George was imprisoned in Al-Qadir, and the monastery preserves chains believed to have held him, and they are shown here on the screen. It isn't the greatest picture, and I think it might be the chain that is housed in Lydda, but it was the only one I could find, so it's still pretty cool. There are a couple chains that supposedly held St. George, so I did the best I could. Pilgrims touch or are lightly bound with the chains as a healing ritual. This practice is shared by both Christians and Muslims. Palestine's St. George feast stands out globally because it is a cross-religious festival where Christians and Muslims celebrate together. It's rooted in local folklore dating back to Byzantine times, and it is centered on healing and protection, not just martyrdom, and is deeply communal, blending ritual, food, and storytelling. It is one of the clearest examples of shared sacred tradition in the Holy Land, and it all is related to our saint of today, St. George. St. George's Day in Lydda, which is in the modern city of Lod in Israel, is remembered primarily through the ancient church of St. George, built over the traditional site of his tomb, where Christians gather for liturgy, veneration of his relics, and commemoration of the martyr's life. The celebration is quieter than the massive festivals in Georgia or Palestine, but it is deeply rooted in history and centered on the saint's actual burial place. Lydda is the traditional place of St. George's burial, and the church built over his tomb is the focal point of all commemorations. It contains the tomb of St. George, shown here on your screen, and tradition holds that his remains were brought here after his execution. Relics and chains associated with his martyrdom are preserved in the church. In fact, I think I might have accidentally shown a picture of it on the prior screen. The first church was built in the 6th century, and it was destroyed and rebuilt several times. Most recently, it was restored in 1872. Lydda is not just another place where St. George is honored, though. It is the geographical and spiritual center of his cult. His mother was traditionally from Lydda, linking him to the city. His relics were brought here after his martyrdom, making it the earliest known site of his veneration. And the church today stands as a continuous witness to his legacy from the Byzantine era to now. But the truth is this: St. George's story is not about dragons or swords. It is about far more than the elaborate myths and fanciful legends that have developed around him. Because you see, here's the thing about St. George. He isn't just a saint with a good story. There are many saints with many good stories. No, he's a super saint because his life fuses three archetypes that rarely coexist in one figure: the martyr, the warrior, and the universal hero. And each of these layers calls out something out of us that modern life tends to smother. And St. George, for centuries, was always the ultimate hero for everyone to admire and try and emulate. Every society tells stories about the kind of people it admires. These stories become mirrors, reflecting who we are, and maps showing who we might become. In fact, who we will become. Because what you admire, you become. But something strange has happened in our age. We've learned to sneer at real heroes while romanticizing the bad ones. We distrust courage, we mock virtue, and we treat moral clarity as naive. Yet we elevate influencers, anti-heroes, sex addicts, drug abusers, and charismatic rebels whose only qualification is visibility, greed, and dominance. And the result is predictable. A culture that refuses to honor the truly heroic will not become heroless. It will simply crown new heroes, shallow ones, broken ones, and destructive ones. Our modern society is uncomfortable with genuine heroism. Real heroes remind us of what we lack: discipline, sacrifice, integrity, responsibility, courage that costs something. So we deflect, we deconstruct, we say, no one is really like that, or everyone is flawed, or heroism is just propaganda. We flatten the moral landscape until no one stands taller than anyone else. But this cynicism doesn't liberate us, it leaves us starving. When real heroes are dismissed, the vacuum doesn't stay empty. Into it rush celebrities famous for nothing, influencers selling curated lifestyles, fictional anti-heroes who glamorize nihilism, political strongmen, online personalities who offer belonging without virtue, the promotion of vice as virtue. These figures become quote-unquote heroes, not because they embody anything noble, but because they are loud, confident, and available. They offer identity without responsibility, rebellion without purpose, and charisma without character. They are the dragon wearing a hero's armor. Human beings are wired for aspiration, especially young men. We need figures who show us what true courage looks like, what goodness costs, and what a life of meaning requires. When we lose these models, we lose the ability to imagine ourselves as better than we are. And a society that mocks the heroic eventually forgets how to become heroic, and the consequences are devastating. And you can see many of those consequences right now ravaging our society, especially among our young men. Suicide is now one of the leading causes of death for young men. Male youth die by suicide at a significantly higher rate than female youth in most regions of the world, including North America and Europe. Young men often show fewer warning signs, fewer attempts, fewer verbalized ideations, making prevention harder. Substance abuse disorders are a major risk factor for male youth suicide. And mental illness is rising sharply. Mental illness has become one of the leading causes of health burden among adolescents and young adults. The increase is not just better diagnosis, it reflects a genuine public health crisis. Social isolation and loss of community are at the heart of this crisis. Young men today report fewer closer friendships, with 1 in 4 young men reporting having no friends whatsoever. This is a huge problem. There's less community involvement, less mentorship, and more time spent alone or online. The extended transition from adolescence to adulthood, now stretching into the mid-20s, has created a prolonged period of instability and identity confusion. Economic instability and the collapse of traditional pathways have added gasoline to this raging cultural firestorm. The old script for becoming a man, job, marriage, home, family, is breaking down. Contributing factors include rising housing costs, declining real wages for young men, increased competition for stable jobs, longer educational pathways, delayed marriage and family formation, and continued advances in artificial intelligence is only going to make this problem infinitely worse in the future. The on-ramp to a steady employment and stable adulthood is increasingly being blocked right at the starting gate. And these pressures create a sense of drift where young men feel they have no clear role or even a future. And digital overload and social media pressure exacerbate the crisis. The Youth Mental Health Review identifies social media, online comparison, digital overstimulation, and exposure to extreme content on the internet, as well as rampant online pornography use, which is often used as a substitute for real relationships with real women, as being a major problem. This is a terrible crisis, and one not talked about enough. And all of these issues are leading to rising anxiety, depression, and cultural instability. Alcohol, cannabis, and other substances are increasingly used as coping mechanisms for loneliness, stress, lack of purpose, and emotional suppression. And rather than be supportive, our contemporary culture has turned downright hostile to men in general and young men in particular. There's a growing cultural script that treats young men less like citizens in formation and more like a demographic to be preemptively scolded. In schools, media, and public discourse, they're often framed as latent problems, future abusers, future dropouts, future extremists, long before they are recognized as actual human beings with potential, vulnerability, or complexity. The message is unmistakable. Masculinity is toxic, and young men must constantly prove they're not dangerous before they're allowed to be seen as good. This hostility doesn't emerge from nowhere. It's the byproduct of a society that's far more comfortable diagnosing men than listening to them. Instead of asking why so many young men feel aimless, isolated, or economically sidelined, the culture often responds with suspicion or moralizing. And when young men do speak up about their struggles, they're told they're complaining, fragile, or centering themselves. It's a neat trick. Pathologize them, then shame them for noticing. The irony is this, that a society that claims to care about equality can't bring itself to extend basic empathy to half its population. The result is a generation of young men who feel alienated, not because they reject the culture, but because the culture has already rejected them. Which, ironically, further isolates young men, and thus they seek sources that do speak to them without pre-condemnation. The only sources, it seems, that do seem to care about their crisis. And that leads them to be easy prey of exactly the kind of truly toxic anti-heroes that reach out to them. If the only people that will take an interest in a society's young men are monsters, don't be surprised when you create a lot of monsters. It can all be very depressing and even overwhelming. What young men need, what they've always needed, is a hero, a real hero, a real example to follow. And luckily, we appear to have one handy. St. George, the crisis young men face today, loneliness, loss of purpose, identity confusion, lack of initiation, digital addiction, economic instability, is not just social or psychological. It is mythic. It is the collapse of a story. And St. George gives young men a story again. Young men today often feel directionless, unneeded, unsure of their role, and without a clear path into adulthood. St. George embodies a life organized around a mission to protect the vulnerable, to resist injustice, and to serve something higher than yourself, namely Jesus Christ. St. George shows that masculinity is not about dominance, it's about purposeful responsibility. This is the antidote to drift. Many young men feel powerless in society, ashamed of their natural aggression, and unsure how to express strength without being labeled harmful. St. George shows that strength is good when it is disciplined, courage is noble when it is moral, and power is justified when it is protective. He gives young men permission to be strong, but in the right direction. Young men face dragons they can't name. George names the enemy. The modern dragons are internal and invisible. Drug or alcohol addiction, pornography use, depression, isolation, digital overstimulation, ideological extremism, and hopelessness. Young men feel overwhelmed because the enemy is everywhere and nowhere. The dragon is a symbol that externalizes the threat, makes the invisible visible, and gives shape to the struggle, and allows young men to fight with clarity. George teaches your enemy is real and it can be defeated. Many young men lack mentors. George becomes an archetype. Many young boys and young men today often grow up without fathers, mentors, any kind of initiation rite, or male role models. St. George becomes a mentor through myth, a model of virtue, a guide for moral courage, and a symbol of what a man can be. He fills the vacuum left by absent or confused role models. Young men are told masculinity is toxic. George shows masculinity can be holy. Cultural messaging often frames masculinity as dangerous, outdated, or problematic. This leaves young men ashamed of their natural traits. St. George shows that masculinity that is courageous but compassionate, strong but self-sacrificing, assertive but moral, warrior-like but gentle. He proves masculinity can be redemptive. George also shows that suffering can be transformative. Young men often interpret suffering as failure, shame, or weakness. St. George's martyrdom reframes suffering as witness, integrity, strength, and transformation. He teaches that pain can be meaningful, not meaningless. Young men need a story, and George gives them a story, the ultimate story. This is the deepest connection. Modern culture gives young men no rights, no myths, no heroic narrative, no symbolic world. St. George gives them a dragon to fight, a princess to protect, a tyrant to resist, a god to serve, and a story to inhabit. He restores the mythic architecture of manhood. St. George gives young men what the modern world has taken from them: a mission, a model, a moral compass, and a mythic story that makes sense of their struggle. And there is no mission greater now than being on a mission for our Lord, Jesus Christ, as St. George was. He has risen and conquered death once and for all. And our mission, our ultimate quest, purpose and call in life is to proclaim this glorious news to a hostile world filled to the absolute brim with dragons. And this is a job for a hero. And St. George calls us to take up our sword and join him in this heroic quest, which is why I think the story and example of St. George is more important today than it ever was. The world needs more St. Georges in it, and all of them on the great battlefield of this fallen world. That dragon is not going to slay itself. It is time to join in the fight. Happy St. George Day. So as we end our discussion of the great St. George today, we will close with a prayer for his feast day. Let us pray. Almighty God, you commissioned your holy martyr George to bear before the rulers of this world the banner of the cross. Strengthen us in our battles against the great serpent of sin and evil, that we too may obtain the crown of eternal life, through Jesus Christ our Redeemer, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. Thank you for spending your Saturday morning with us. Next week, we'll be exploring yet another hero from our Christian past. So be sure to tune in. Until then, keep your faith warm, your cappuccino hot and frothy, and have a great week. See you next week for another Saturday Cappuccino with the Saints.